My name is Laura Freeman. I'm a principal educator at NHS Education for Scotland. I'm a part of the psychological interventions and adult mental health team. So, Laura, you've already done a brilliant review, actually, of all the psychosocial interventions and the psychological interventions. And I'm going to build on that. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the psychological interventions, but I am going to be looking more broadly at that question of engagement and where does harm reduction fit into this? Because when you start looking at the ways in which we can work with psychostimulants, I think harm reduction is the starting point. That's the place where we start to pull people in. So I'm hoping that with this presentation, I'll build on what you've started us with, and I'm hoping to build on more of that hope in terms of the specific strategies and the specific harm reduction information that you can provide to people. My background is this. You can't tell by my accent, but I've been here for 23 years. I was trained in the States. I was trained as a clinical psychologist, but I did my clinical training actually in New Haven, Connecticut in 1991 at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic. So I actually was trained very specifically in what are the psychological and also the psychiatric and the pharmacological treatments that are there for cocaine. It's been a long time since I was in New Haven, and again, I've been here for 23 years. But I have watched the stimulant issues develop in Scotland over those years. Some of you in Glasgow will have known that I had a day course that we used to run about 15 years ago. And so we had a course, and I've also worked up in Aberdeen City in terms of working with stimulants too. But most of my work has been more general lately in terms of psychological interventions and training. So this is a brilliant chance to go back to stimulants. So, differences and similarities. When Sophie, when you asked me to speak, when we were talking about this yesterday, you had said this was one of those questions, and I'm going to try to build this in. What are the differences and similarities in terms of the depressant drugs that we tend to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and the stimulants, which are a part of life of all of the people that we work with? I'll come back to this, because we'll come back to the polysubstance cocktail. But when you're looking at the stimulants, you're looking at a CNS stimulant as opposed to a depressant, so you have those basic differences in terms of the impact on the brain and also behavior. And this is what we've just been talking about. There is no substitute prescription, but that's the specific point, and that is, it's a very specific point. We know that we don't have a substitute prescription. We don't rely on the carrot. And in doing this and talking about this, we can talk about the different prescribing strategies for treatment of symptoms, which is where my point was in terms of looking at individually and in a person-centered way, what are the prescribing strategies that might be appropriate for that person. So that is there. But this is the interesting one, and this is what we just touched on, that question of people will say, and I will put that in quotation marks, stimulants are said to be more of a recreational pattern, and the motivation to change is low. We don't have a carrot of the prescription to get people in. But I would argue that that's the same thing that we deal with when we're working with alcohol problems, and when we're working with people who are drinking in a binge pattern. Same problem that we have with the benzodiazepines. This isn't actually different. It's actually that methadone has been used as that substitute prescription, and that's different. All of the other substances, we actually have to look at that motivational issue. How do we engage? How do we pull people in? And how do we use harm reduction strategies to help people feel that it's worthwhile to come back and see you again? these last two pieces, it'll be interesting to see what your reaction is. Withdrawal is more neuropsychological. When I used to do this training regularly, I'd say, people will say it's all in my head. Well, guess what? The withdrawal is all in the head. There is a very specific withdrawal pattern when you are looking at the psychostimulants and cocaine, and it goes back to the dopamine depletion. But it is neuropsychological. In other words, with the depressant drugs, we tend to have a physiological withdrawal syndrome that we can look at and identify. But with the stimulants and cocaine, what you're looking at is still a withdrawal process, but you're going to be looking at it in terms of the behavior and in terms of mental health. You're going to be looking at it in terms of how people feel, and that's how it's expressed in terms of this. And this is the one that I really like. Actually, the work with stimulants is very much grounded in research. And I'll come back to this. Because in terms of prescribing strategies, we know that there's been a lot of research done, and this was going on back in 1991 when I was in New Haven, and they were looking at disulfiram. We have decades of research looking at what is the most appropriate prescribing strategy, and nothing has pinged as a substitute prescription. However, when you are using all those psychosocial interventions, what we do is we look at the research in terms of cocaine, and we look at how do we match these symptoms with these psychosocial interventions. And so in general, I'm not going to go into the psychosocial interventions more specifically, but I will talk about a phased approach. And I think we need to look at a phased approach when you're working with people who are using cocaine. And the first step of that phased approach, we'll keep talking about this for the rest of my talk, is how do you engage? And how do you use your harm reduction work as that starting point for engagement and motivation? And one of the things that will come up is very specifically that information on cocaine that we can give to people. That's absolutely essential. And it's that knowledge that facilitates understanding, and that knowledge that helps people look at what is the potential for change. And I think that's one of the keys. So I'm hoping that over these slides, that gives you the hope. So we listed all of the different, Laura, you had listed all of the different strategies that are there, the psychosocial, psychological, the behavioral interventions that are there in terms of cocaine. What we're going to do is we're going to use the information that we know about cocaine, and we're going to basically look at those treatment approaches and adapt treatment to the specific issues that cocaine presents and to the specific symptoms that people have. So this is where I have to talk very quickly because we do go through a lot of information in this talk. And Sophie, I'll ask you to keep an eye on my time and give me a wave when I'm getting close to my half hour. Because CNS stimulants, so central nervous system stimulants, we all know this, they basically activate the 3 Fs, the fight, flight, fright. There's another F that we can use. Actually, freeze is often used too. We can also use another F, which is essential to harm reduction work, but I'm not going to use it actually in a presentation. But these are the arousal responses of the body. And that's what cocaine actually activates. In the brain, it has a strong impact on both the dopamine systems and also the serotonin systems. It's a very powerful reinforcer of behavior. We measure drugs in terms of addictive potential, and that is a term that looks at how quickly does a person develop a compulsive pattern of use of drug. And we know that cocaine has a very high addictive potential. And part of this is those reward processes, those reward pathways of the brain, which are already involved in those naturally pleasurable experiences. People enjoy it. But what you have is stimulants activate that system very intensely. When I'm training, I will often have Kit Kats that we'll talk about in terms of triggered reactions of the reward system. So a triggered reaction of, here's a Kit Kat. If you were using, here's a Kit Kat for anyone. If you were using cocaine, you'd see that Kit Kat, and that would be the best chocolate in the world. That would be like the most expensive Belgian chocolate that you could buy if you ate that chocolate when you were using cocaine. Because it basically takes those natural, pleasurable experiences and makes them that much more pleasurable. However, they activate the system intensely, all that dopamine starts to flood, and then you get what's called dopamine depletion, which we already mentioned. And you have the crash that's experienced after that and the extreme lows. So what we'll talk about is that people go to ecstasy to misery in seconds. Very quickly, people go from that sense of ecstasy and then down to misery with that dopamine depletion. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But that then becomes, if you've been experiencing that euphoria and then all of a sudden you're down to that dysphoria, I'll put up my next slide, post-stimulant dysphoria, what are you going to use? You're going to use more cocaine, aren't you? And that's where people get into that process of using so many times during the day, because they're continually trying to have a run of cocaine that keeps them experiencing the euphoria. Unfortunately, tolerance develops quickly, and what people will say is the first hit is the pinnacle, and then after that, tolerance develops. And they keep chasing that first euphoria, much like we talk about a heroin injection that first time. People keep trying to chase that first euphoria, but the first hit is that pinnacle of experience. And what happens is after use, mood does not return to the baseline. So you experience that euphoria, dopamine floods, then you crash, and then you start coming back up, but you don't come back up to where you were before. You hover a little bit lower. And that's where people, when they crash, they don't come all the way back up, so they need that cocaine more to actually get that feeling of being normal again. And the tendency, though, and this is where we talk about motivational work, is if you ask people, though, they will only remember the positives of using. And that's one of the interesting things. In research, we find that people don't remember the dysphoria, they remember the euphoria. And that's what keeps people going. What we need to know when we're talking about harm reduction, and this comes into overdose risk and overdose deaths, is depression may lead to suicide ideation. And here's the interesting thing, when we look at co-occurring mental health issues, that crash should be relieved by sleep unless there is other mental health or health problems. So the bottom line as we go through this is think about harm reduction in its broadest sense. When people have been using and when they crash, they don't need more cocaine, do they? What do they need to do? They need sleep. Their body needs to recover. So here's my first harm reduction pointer for you. If you have somebody who's experiencing a cocaine crash, what you need to do is you need to assess for suicide ideation. We need to be looking and making sure that we assess for suicide ideation, that we protect people from self-harm, that we protect people from using other drugs that they think will actually help them feel better. I think that's a part of that protection, because what people need is they need sleep, food, and water. When we go back to dopamine depletion, the natural ways that the body actually restores its dopamine stores is during sleep, with food being the building blocks, providing the building blocks for the restoration of the dopamine, and they need water to rehydrate themselves. So as you think about this and as you provide information to people, this is really key. And how many of you will work with people who have maybe been binging on the weekends, and maybe 3 days later they say, yeah, I totally feel absolutely awful. And one of the things that you need to do is help people know that it takes a while for the body to recover. That you crash, you don't come back up to your baseline, you hover before. So you need to take care of your body. When awake, assess depression, suicide ideation, look at what other mental health concerns might there be. Is there anxiety there? Is there depression? Is there a history of trauma? And assess any psychotic symptoms because of the potential for stimulant-induced psychosis. Any psychotic symptoms should remit quickly with cocaine, and if they're using amphetamines, over a few days. But as we move into more specifically, more general harm reduction issues, we've already talked about it just very briefly. We have to know that here in Scotland, people tend to use a polysubstance cocktail. That's the way that I always like to put it. There's a polysubstance cocktail, and people tend to use substances functionally. They tend to use substances based on what it does for them. Back in 1998, I think I have it right here, in the Harm Reduction Center in Dundee, there was a study that looked at women who were injecting drug users. And one of the interesting things, I had just come over to Scotland a couple of years before, and I kept asking people, what are the different drugs that are being used? What's the pattern in terms of depressants? What's the pattern in terms of stimulants? And people said, oh Lord, no. People in Scotland, we like our depressants, is what everybody said. And then this research came out from Rhoda McRae. And what that found was women injecting drug users were reporting, I think it was around 60% of those women were reporting use of amphetamines, that they were injecting amphetamines. Why do you think they were injecting amphetamines? Say again? One, potentially functional, to lose weight. Why else, if you are injecting heroin, if you're on a methadone script, if you're using benzos, why would you inject amphetamines? Exactly, especially when the kids are coming home from school, when you need to get the kids, when you need that extra energy, then you inject your amphetamines. And that was the pattern that came out of this qualitative study. It was a very strong pattern that people used both depressants because there was so high of use of depressant drugs to be able to function. People needed, especially cocaine, gives them a fast-acting stimulant to give them the energy to do the things that they need to do.
Sometimes, like, because the high is so high, they need to put that unique value into, like, when you explain again, so it becomes what John was saying earlier, like, so bad ones, people are experiencing that what makes them day.
Exactly. So it becomes a cycle. And people use the uppers to come up, they use the depressants to come down. This makes it more difficult to identify use and when people are using stimulants because they're using it to get back to a baseline. It doesn't necessarily look like they're high, they're just using it to function normally. And I think that's the really important piece. But it leads to a huge risk in terms of overdose because of the cycle of the ups and downs.
I think especially when people have not been using opiates as one of the tough opiates, and it's been like medical, that the minute you go back to a heavier opiate like heroin or something, the overdose is even higher as well. People are not expecting to get that.
Yeah. So these are the things to talk to people about. This is the information that people need to start thinking about in terms of themselves. Part of this is the half-life. Cocaine has a short half-life. It'll say, some books say 60, some say 90 minutes. So 60 to 90 minutes But here's the interesting thing in terms of the community reinforcement approach and that reward pathway. It appears that the euphoria effect, the pleasurable effect, even though the half-life is maybe 60 minutes, the pleasurable effect seems to be limited to 30 minutes. So you're only going to get about 30 minutes of feeling good. And that, again, is why people inject multiple times. It leads to binges. It leads to the high risk of compulsive use. You have just what you're saying, the interaction with the half-lives of other substances. If you're using methadone and benzodiazepines, which are long-acting substances, you take yourself up with a stimulant, but then you think, oh God, I need to come down because I need to go to sleep. So you take more to come down. Once the stimulant works out of your body, you crash with the whole weight of the depressant drug. And this is what people need to know in terms of the risk of overdose. That dopamine depletion, when people have been using cocaine, dopamine depletion can take up to 3 months for recovery. And this is what people need to know. You don't just stop using cocaine and feel better. It's gonna take a while. It's gonna take up to 3 months for just the chemicals in your brain to actually be restored, to have those dopamine stores restored. So very quickly, harm reduction. People need to know about cocaethylene then. And we've already had this mentioned, but cocaethylene, the important thing about cocaethylene, if that pleasurable effect of cocaine is self-limited to about 30 minutes, guess what you can do to extend the pleasure? You take alcohol. People will do this without knowing this. People need the information that cocaethylene extends that pleasurable feeling, but it comes with a huge price. It comes with a it's a higher level of toxicity to the cardiovascular system. It has a much more harsh impact on the liver, and it exacerbates dependency and withdrawal issues. And guess what? You add in methadone, benzos, alcohol, cocaine, and we have a recipe for overdose deaths, don't we? Especially if people aren't talking to us about the cocaine that they're using. So if they are using, think about the number of people that you work with who will say to you, oh yeah, I use benzos and I use opiates and I'll drink some alcohol every once in a while. We know that. If we don't know that they're using cocaine on top of that, you don't know about both the cocaine impact but also the cocaethylene impact. And people do need that specific harm reduction information, especially if there's any bloodborne virus, if there is any BBV history. People need to know the danger of cocaethylene. Now, unique characteristics of cocaine to address in harm reduction. This is much more specific. It's a powerful stimulant of the reward system. Now, I was trying to keep my computer alive because this is actually, I'm just going to do this really quick. Because we get to the story of some rats and some chimps. And this tells you what the difference is between methadone and stimulants. It's a powerful psychostimulant, strong reinforcer of behavior, and it overwrites the behaviors necessary for survival. You had put up the parts of the brain where cocaine actually impacts. And I can't remember exactly which little part of the brain it is, but there's a part of the brain that actually controls our survival behaviors. Those are the behaviors where it tells us to eat. It tells us to drink water. It tells us to have good relationships and to procreate. Cocaine overwrites those survival parts of the brain. So here's your story. Story of some rats and chimps. Rats with free access to heroin. This is out of a book called Cocaine, A Definitive History by Dominic Streetfield. It's a really brilliant read. It's one of the most fun books that you can read. So I can write it down. If anybody wants this quote, I can give it to you. Rats with free access to heroin within days. Now remember that these rats are in a cage, so you don't have a natural environment. This is a behavioral study. Rats with free access to heroin. Within days, they had a pattern of taking heroin. They'd sleep, they'd eat, they'd wander around, they'd take some heroin, they'd sleep, they'd eat, they'd groom. At the end of the month, all of the rats were dependent on heroin, but they were relatively healthy. They were all eating, grooming, and drinking water. Rats with free access to cocaine took cocaine. Full stop. That's it. They took cocaine. That was all they did. They took cocaine until they collapsed. Then they'd wake up and then they'd take more cocaine. And they woke up, they started to take it again, they neglected to eat. Again, this goes back to the diet issues. They neglected to eat, they neglected to groom, they neglected relationships, they neglected to drink water, and at the end of the month, they were all dead. I want you to think about harm reduction issues here. I want you to think about that issue of how do we respond to people empathically about their needs when they have been using cocaine. And for many of the people that we work with, it'll be complicated because they'll be using other things too. But it is to actually look at these holistic issues, these basic health issues. Eating, sleeping, and drinking water, drinking enough water. Are you giving the body enough to recover? In a test of addictive potential of cocaine, researchers had to stop an experiment when a chimp got to the point where it would press a bar for cocaine almost 13,000 times for a single dose. That is how addictive cocaine can be. Now again, those were laboratory experiments. They weren't out in the natural environment, which is where the community reinforcement approach comes. Because if you create a rewarding environment, we know that that gives people the other options. But that's what we have to do in terms of harm reduction. Okay, very specifically, harm reduction. What was cocaine? What has cocaine been used for in years past? Anesthetic. Think about this in terms of injecting behavior. Think about injecting all of those times during a day. Think about injecting 10 times a day. Think about the pain that that must bring about. Think about breathing in crack cocaine and those really hot vapors. Well, guess what? Cocaine is a very strong anesthetic. And so it masks the pain that people are feeling. And in a harm reduction context, this is key for us because people continue to do behaviors that create pain and that create harm to their body because they're anesthetized. There's that anesthetic property of cocaine. It reduces, it hides pains. It is essential that we talk to people about this. It's essential as a part of our harm reduction information. Plays an important role in damage from smoking and injecting. But it also strongly constricts blood vessels. And this goes back to the cardiotoxic issues. If you're thinking about somebody with an injection site assessment, you want the blood flowing freely, don't you? You want oxygenated blood flowing through the body. But cocaine constricts the blood vessels. And so that will be another factor that you have to think about in terms of injection sites. So just 2 last slides. Am I okay, Sophie, on time? I've stopped looking at my time. I'm just trying to go very fast. Cocaine and crack cocaine. Over the years, there's always been a lot of confusion about cocaine and crack cocaine. Are they the same? Are they different? What are the different issues in terms of these 2 different drugs? It's actually really simple. When we're talking about the salt acid version of cocaine, the white powder, we're talking about a salt acid version. And cocaine hydrochloride, the white powder, it's one of the most diverse in use. You can rub that powder on your gums, you can snort it, you can eat it, you can rub it on the genitals, you can inject it, it can go up body cavities. It's very diverse because it gets absorbed through the mucus system very easily. It's water soluble, so you can inject it, but it's a waste to smoke it. It doesn't burn. It doesn't actually start releasing the psychoactive ingredients until it gets to 195 degrees, and then it just burns and breaks down. So if people are sprinkling white powder and cocaine in their cigarettes, guess what? They aren't getting much from it. They may think they are, but it doesn't have that strong of an effect. To smoke cocaine, you have to turn it to its base form. And that's the difference. So it's a base alkaloid form. Now, patterns of use, cocaine hydrochloride will be used. We talked about the recreational use. And somebody pointed out to me that one of the big differences between cocaine and crack is that cocaine is something that people will use in restaurants and in toilets and anywhere that you can think, because it's acceptable to use amongst different groups in public. But crack cocaine is not. And there you get the social isolation or the isolation amongst a certain group of users. And it becomes much more stigmatized, doesn't it? And so, freebase, crack, cooked, smokable cocaine, people treat it. It's treated either with ammonia and sometimes ether. Does anyone remember Richard Pryor's stories about making freebasing and lighting himself on fire? Or bicarbonate of soda, baking soda, and it turns it back to the base alkaloid form. Okay? There, now it vaporizes at 98 degrees Celsius and can smoke. The pipe, it can be a water pipe, it might have alcohol in it, it might be a glass or a metal tube that people use to smoke it up. One of the most important harm reduction issues, when you have people who say they're using crack, I keep saying this, please ask this. One, are you buying your crack as crack? And if you're buying it as rocks, then probably, if it's been made with ammonia, it's probably dissipated. But if you are making your own smokable cocaine, let's just put it in the most generic way, we need to know whether or not people are using ammonia to turn it back to its base form. Why do we want to know? Why do we want to know if people are using ammonia? Oh, because people are smoking it without actually letting the ammonia dissipate. Now I want you to think about breathing in heated ammonia fumes. And I want you to think about the damage to the lungs. We need to know, and people need to know this basic harm reduction information. We need to know how they are making, if they are buying cocaine hydrochloride, the white powder, and if they're making their own crack. Please ask. Yeah.
See when people go back the whole thing to not see it as crack. People would want to be, they're talking about freebase, they do not call it that. So I think even that, to raise that conversation, they might go up with that crack.
And it's, crack is a funny word because it has such stigma to it. And to actually get people back to just thinking about, are you using cocaine? Are you using it in the salt acid form? Or are you using it in the smokable form? And that might be crack. Yeah. Just as a basic harm reduction piece of information that can help people understand. Yeah, that's a brilliant point. Because our terminology changes. You want to know how people are using it, and if they're turning it back to the base alkaloid, how do you do it? Because of the potential impact on the lungs. And here's the last thing. I think this is the last slide. Yep. Let me end on this. We've talked a lot about overdose deaths in Scotland. We're talking a lot about the number of deaths that we are having. One of the things that really concerns me is COPD and actually breathing issues. And this, some of you will know, I will talk about sleep disorders and sleep apnea. People who have problems breathing are going to be at higher risk for dying of an overdose. And so one of the most basic harm reduction issues is to have these conversations about, are you smoking your cocaine? Do you know what it can do to your lungs? And do you know how dangerous that is in terms of the potential for overdose death? So I'll leave you with that. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.